You can see it all. It's pretty baller. You can hear it, you can see it, you can smell it, you can touch it. I would say you could taste it, but that's just you looking at your computer monitor and it's gross. It's got flavor. That's disgusting. All right. So your first little part of this section deals with politics. Again, it's all politics, but specifically political spectrum. And I've shown you this spectrum before, but let's just put it up on the board again for our understanding. So this refers to the idea of conservatism versus liberalism. And then at the very edges, we have extremism. So basically understand this. We all have our attitudes about politics, and they often don't fall in the lines along a political party, especially in the United States. For instance, you tend to have people who maybe are very liberal in terms of like medical care. They think, for instance, that the government should have one healthcare system, but maybe they think gun control should be really not very extreme or something like that. You have a conservative idea and a liberal idea kind of jammed together in one head. So where does this put you? Well, it doesn't really fit in Democratic or Republican party-wise, but it does fit on a spectrum. That's to say that we are all somewhere along the lines of whether we're liberal or conservative. So what do these terms mean? What does liberal mean? You guys remember? Crickets. We talked about this a little while ago.
They wanted to give more power to elected parliament.
All right, that's a traditional expectation, but basically we're talking about new age in a sense. Somebody who wants things to be new ideas, that sort of thing, versus somebody who wants things the old-fashioned way. What it really comes down to is that liberals tend to focus more on the rights of the many, the good of the many, and conservatives tend to look at the rights of the few, the protecting of the few. Now, what this really means is, for instance, a conservative viewpoint is that you shouldn't have to give up your individual rights for the good of society, whereas a liberal would say there are certain rights that we don't need to have for the good of society. Does that kind of make sense? Like take on gun control, for instance. If you believe that everyone in this country has a right to bear arms with little infringement from the government, that tends to be conservative, whereas liberals would say people don't need guns because our society has other means of protections and basically you're in more danger having it. Does that kind of make sense? So these are two different attitudes. Now, traditionally, like we're talking about in the 1800s, liberals tended to be the ideas of the revolution, of the Enlightenment. They want that sort of government, the government of the many. And then conservatives tend to like the system of the kings and queens that we had before the revolution. Yeah?
Government of like the many, is that people? People?
Yeah, M-A-N-Y. Yeah.
Okay, I just didn't know.
Yeah. The many. That's a good Star Trek reference there. I'm good. So anyways, most people tend to fall on a spectrum here. So for instance, we start in the very, very middle of the center. That means you basically have attitudes of both. Now, if you lean to one or more side, you might be liberal or conservative. Just kind of left of the center, just right to the center. If you're on an extreme side of thing, you're either radical or reactionary. So basically, these are the extreme viewpoints of things. It's only liberal, it's only conservative. Does that kind of make sense? Like these are sort of a mix of, this is a perfect mix of both. This is mostly liberal with a little bit of conservative, and this is mostly conservative with a little bit of liberal, and then these are none of the above, and just the one side. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, what this meant in the 19th century is we have these new ideas that are these ideas of the Enlightenment, and these countries adapting them, and these kind of warring ideologies between those who were in power, these be your nobles, and the middle class, which tend to fall the liberals, and those who are the sort of cutting-edge revolutionaries, like Robespierre. Actually, not even really Robespierre. He's a bad example, but like what's his name? Danton, folks like that, who tend to be on the radical side of things. Reactionaries tend to be like your ultra-royalists, who really want all this revolutionary nonsense to just go away so we can go back to absolute monarchy. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? So we have this spectrum here happening. In addition, we have this attitude of nationalism spreading. Nationalists tend to have this extreme pride in their nation. But here's the thing is when I say nation, I don't mean country. We tend to say, like, the United States is a nation and not know what it really means. Nation does not refer to sovereignty. It doesn't refer to a government. It refers to a group of people that share a common background. So you could even debate whether or not the United States is even a nation, seeing as we have so many different people from different places around the world. Other places, though, which are much more uniform in its population, a little bit more national. Does that kind of make sense? So what happens then if you have a nation that has a political group that controls it, that is a country? Well, that's a nation state. Okay? State refers to the political structure. So the United States is definitely a state. Other places, though, maybe don't have this political union. Maybe, for instance, like in the Ottoman Empire, you had the Greeks. Greece, as a country, did not exist. The Greeks were an ethnic group that lived in parts of the Ottoman Empire. So they want to break free, revolt from the Ottomans, and form a sovereign nation, and form a nation state. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, here's the issue. The Greeks by themselves could not do that. They did not have the political, they had the political, I should say, but they didn't have the military might to do so. So what happened was they got help from the British and the Russians, as well as the French to some extent, to break free from the Ottoman Empire. The question is why would they do that? Why would the British be interested in that? And partially it's because of this idea of Christianity versus the Muslims. It's this whole idea of the Crusades, but also it has to do with control of the Dardanelles, as well as this attempt to put Christian nations on a border between Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and the rest of Europe, against this idea of a balance of power. But nationalism is ultimately what allows the Greeks to kind of rise up and form as one people to revolt in the first place and form a new country. So Greece is one of the examples we have of a nation breaking free from an empire and forming a nation state. And we're going to see this attempted and in some cases successful throughout many different places in Europe at this time. You might remember that most of Europe are empires at this point. They formed colonies across the world, and in some cases, like we saw in Latin America, are losing those colonies. And we're going to see this throughout the next 100 years as well, as these colonial powers start to fragment due to the pressures of nationalism and liberalism and these ideas that were unleashed by the Enlightenment. So things are going to keep changing. In some cases, though, they're not quite as successful. Poland, for instance, the Poles, if you recall, had a nation that had been destroyed by a combination of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and they wanted to try to break free. So they try to do this, and the Russian army crushes that rebellion, so Poland fails to get its independence. Italy, on the other hand, their main problem wasn't that they were under the thumb of another country, though parts of it certainly were. Their problem was a lack of unity in the first place. If you ask anyone from Italy, where are you from, odds are good they're going to refer to the city they're from, not the country. And the reason behind that is the Italian city-states were independent. That is one of the reasons why it was the first site of the Renaissance. They did not have the same problems that larger nations did, so they could keep going on and keep remaining independent of one another. But that independence costs them as well, as they cannot band together and utilize each other's resources for the betterment of a country. So understand, Italy as a country doesn't really exist yet. However, they're going to have some successes in unifying during the 19th century. Indeed, by the end of the 19th century, they're more or less going to be one nation with one set of goals. But that's even with that, they're still a fairly diverse people. The main unifying factor being culture and language. So this is something that is quite different. Yeah, go ahead. It's the same sort of thing, like when we tend to say like food comes from like Italian or Chinese or things like that, it's really like, it's not a very accurate description. Consider this. how cooking differs within the United States, like the traditional meals you might have if you're in New York City versus what you might have in Louisville, Kentucky. All right, that's pretty different. The same thing applies to other nations as well. Consider that. There are different schools, different styles of cooking. Same thing in Italy, same thing in China. And this is just a small portion. There's language difference, there's culture, there's all these different things. So they have similarities, but they have differences as well, if that makes any sense. So these differences, especially in Italy more than anything, are going to keep them from unifying for quite some time. But we're going to see nationalism, this idea of, hey, we're all Italian, we're all these ideas, that starts to unify people and starts this idea of, hey, we need to form a country. Same thing happens in Germany. Germany has all these different states, different ideas, and different places that are going to unify under the banner of pan-Germanism, This idea of all of us together because we share these cultural elements and the pride in these cultural elements. And that's significant. This pride is what's going to drive these people to try to separate themselves from these multinational empires and form their own nations. So this is where the map of Europe really starts to change, and really what starts to fuel the wars we're going to see throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. So as far as motivation is concerned, you can't get rid of that, this nationalist pride. The old orders. I'm not quite sure what you... Oh, no. Each of these are different sections, different titles. It doesn't matter, really, but, So on to France. So France, as you recall, after Napoleon was defeated, had a new king. Well, this king in 1830 is Charles X. And he wants to go back to this traditional system of absolute monarchy. And when he does that and attempts to do this, well, we saw what happened in Les Mis. People were pretty upset about it and decided to try to revolt. And they end up replacing him, instead of with a republic, with a new king, which is Louis Philippe, known as the Citizen King. The reason behind this is Louis Philippe's allies, the guys who get him into power, are the middle class. These folks who are the emerging, kind of like New Age aristocracy. They're not given power, prestige through position and birth order, but rather through the amount of money they have at their disposal. These are the factory owners. These are the new businessmen, that sort of thing. And their style was different. For instance, the clothing that you all saw in Les Mis, the types of coats and hats, that was middle-class fashion. The aristocracy dressed differently than the middle-aged class. This is no real different than the way people dress differently based on social class in the United States. And one of the things that signified Louis Philippe's allegiances was he no longer dressed like the aristocracy. He dressed like the middle class. He would take walks throughout Paris. He would talk to his citizens, and that meant that people could sort of identify with him. The problem was that he was so ensconced in the middle class agenda and put so much effort into increasing the revenues and increasing the privileges of his friends that he kind of alienates the majority of the people. In the end, there's another revolt against his reign in 1848 because he loses his initial popular support, and a second revolution occurs and establishes a republic. Now, you notice I have in quotation marks. What I mean by republic is it was a republic, but the guy who's elected is basically a dictator. You notice his name? Yeah, he's related to the original Napoleon. And he ends up making himself the new emperor. Oops. But how do the people react to this? How would you think in France? They fight another revolution? Nope. They are tired of political instability. And if Napoleon is, and this is Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, he crowns himself Louis Napoleon III later, is good at, is maintaining political stability. He's actually very good at organizing a government. Under him, the economy of France bounces back, it stabilizes, people are getting jobs, life is getting great. The only thing he's not really good at is military stuff, which is kind of ironic when you think about how good his, I believe his uncle, great uncle, was at military stuff. For a great example of that, France and Prussia end up fighting a war that lasts 4 weeks because Prussia is able to just steamroll France and ends up like surrounding France within a few weeks and basically forces a resignation, and it's a terrible embarrassment, a huge defeat for France, and basically that's the end of the crown for Louis Napoleon. But other than that, it sets France up on the stage to becoming a stable nation. So this is kind of what's going on there. Russia, on the other hand, is having other problems. You might recall when we talked about Catherine the Great, how she focused a lot more attention on making Russia dependent on serfs. Well, Russia was falling behind politically as well as economically from the rest of Europe. This is the time of the Industrial Revolution. We'll get into what that means here later. But basically, the rest of Europe is encountering changes at an incredible rate. The ability to produce, the ability to transport, all this stuff. And Russia is lagging behind because of, basically what it comes down to is motivation. Consider this. What motivates us to work hard in life? Money. Yeah, money, success, sure, all these things. Will money and success make us happy? It's like, well, not necessarily, but it certainly helps. That's the old adage is that, I don't know if money's going to make me happy, but it's sure worth an effort or something. I don't know. But what it comes down to is that it helps. And money speaks to us. Money is a concrete system of reward. If I do this job well, I will get paid more money. Does that kind of make sense? So money is what gets us to do stuff. And if you're a serf, you don't get that money. Like if you work really, really hard and get a whole bunch of extra harvest, you don't see any of that. It goes to the owner of the land. So what motivation do you have to work hard? Yes, but ostensibly, that's you are given a certain percentage, in terms of what you can eat. It doesn't quite work in this city. You're not getting. You really don't get anything else, to be perfectly honest. And you're right, that is certainly a motivator, but it's not really a good motivator. People need to feel that their efforts are directly tied to what they're going to get out of something. You might call that greed, but it's motivation is what it comes right down to. So what happens is that Russia isn't able to produce like these other nations are. Technologically, they're inferior because of it. So they realize this really because of their loss in the Crimean War. In a nutshell, the Crimean War is fought over this peninsula right here, which is in the Black Sea. It was controlled by the Ottomans. And the Russians basically wanted to control it because they wanted to basically take over the Ottoman Empire for all these other things. And this time, the British and the French side with the Ottomans against the Russians. Why would they do that? Again, balance of power. What happens if Russia gains all these territories? They're gaining new trade ports. They're going to pose more of a direct threat against the nations of Eastern Europe. They're afraid of what Napoleon did, yada, yada. We want to stop that, so we're going to back the Ottomans. Okay? So they do. And the Russians are defeated, and frankly, they had many advantages that they, in a lot of ways, could have won. And they didn't, and they lost, like, embarrassingly, because they didn't have the technology. They couldn't move the troops around. They didn't have the supplies. So in order to get rid of this, to try to amend these problems, in 1861, serfdom is abolished by Alexander II. Now, the reason the Tsar didn't want to do this, why would the Tsar not want to get rid of serfs? Well, who do the serfs serve? Who do they work for? Who controls the land? Not just the wealthy, the nobility, sure. And who's that supports the king, or in this case, the Tsar? nobility. So if he gets rid of the serfs, that's going to anger the nobility. They're going to be mad at him. They might try to overthrow him or what have you. So this is something I don't really want to do, but it has to. So when he does, there's a couple of problems that happen. First of all, he's assassinated, which is, of course, always a problem. And there's going to be some bad things that happen to that because Alexander III, son of Alexander II, starts to not trust anybody and starts using spies on his own people and ends up using a secret police to correct revolutionaries. So, for instance, these guys, freedom for the people, suddenly he disappears and is never heard from again. So the rights of the individual are basically non-existent. And then, in addition to this, you have the problems that, frankly, it was a little too late. For instance, the way it works is that half the land is taken from the nobles and actually paid for by the government, given to the serfs, who are now free. Except it's not given; it's loaned. You have 50 years to pay it back. Now think about this: 50 years to pay back this land. If not, you're held as a debtor. And at this point, debtors could be thrown in prison. So, what's the point? Yes, you've given them some incentive, but they can't leave the land, or else they're in default on their debts. So you're still a serf, essentially, just with a few more privileges. So it's not really enough to motivate them, and it's not enough to really make up the difference that they're facing with the rest of Europe. So this is going to be part of the problem that we're going to see that leads to the Russian Revolution in the 20th century. And then the assassination of Alexander II leads to all these other problems that's going to really make this sort of czar versus the population problem grow. See, the people trust the czar. They think of him as the father of the people, but whenever they do something like this, start cracking down the people, they start to question that. They start to be angry at the czar, and eventually what happens is the people have had enough and fought revolt against him and killed the czar and his entire family. So, I mean, it takes a while to get there, but this is really kind of where we start to see these problems. It's going to take about 70 years for it to really come to fruition. Still, it's a problem. You guys have probably heard of Anastasia, yeah? That whole thing. There's a Disney movie about it. Yeah, that's the czar we're talking about. That's the family in question. And that whole story. We'll get to that. Any questions? Comments, concerns? Okay. Well, that's pretty much it, guys. Go ahead and stop this recording. And then the rest of this.